broadly mirror what was on the ISO tracker and was done manually prior to it all being automated. I think the gaps we've got at the moment are more around the complex install testing, so it's more around RAID, iSCSI, having a few more LVM options, because at the moment we got caught out in the last release because we weren't testing LVM configurations deep enough. And I think this really forms the first phase of testing that we need for server to make sure that people can install their first server in the data center, because I think that's becoming less important for mass server deployments, because most people are doing pre-seeds, which is the final test that they do on a daily basis.
So using pre-seeds as well, isn't it?
So at the moment we actually change the pre-seed that's in the ISO image as part of the setup of the test. So it still installs off the ISO, right, but it actually network boots to kind of kickstart the installation of the ISO. So it's kind of a kludge pre-seed at the moment. So we actually
So you remastered the ISO
yeah,
okay.
we inject a new pre-seed into it based on the one that was.
And then you fiddle with the ISO Linux config as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I can't remember the details, but there's a whole load of stuff that happens in there to make it still installed from the ISO. But
is there, not to jump too far ahead, but is there a reason to not just use the pre-seed that the orchestra guys are shipping to install those items? Because they've already got pre-seeds that they're using through orchestra to install.
For network booting, yeah. So and for network install, and I think that's
that's the next layer okay, gotcha.
Of install testing that we need to do. We're not automatically doing that against the latest mini ISOs. That's what that's driven from on a daily basis, and we should do.
Cool.
So we know when that's broken during release.
So is no one actually testing the ISO install as seen by humans?
We are, but only on master.
What about object testing from American sites?
Upgrade testing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's covered by another set of tests that we have, which go through that process. I'm not that familiar with that, to be honest. So I know I didn't have to write anything. So anybody got any comments on that? Anything that people think we should be testing in terms of install that we're not testing? And this isn't really aimed around the cloud image testing this session, it's more around people who aren't using cloud images. So.
I think it would be nice if there was some kind of automated testing of the actual interactive install procedure.
Yeah.
Because that is what people actually see. I mean, using pre-seeds to do the install is...
We're simulating that process rather than actually testing.
Yeah.
They see that, but
Sorry?
people do see that, but those are not very many people.
You're talking about the manual testing?
Yeah, well, the manual ISO, I think the manual ISO install is a rare thing to actually. It's seen once or twice. I mean, we should be testing it, but it's not like it's a massive use case.
It is a small percentage of the installs being performed, but every single user who has ever done this has seen it.
Yes.
So it is a very high percentage of users that at some point have to interact with it.
So what are you saying that the majority of users are doing instead? Pre-seed?
Yeah, I think very quickly after you've done 2 or 3, you're saying, well, this sucks.
Yeah, pre-seeding or imaging.
There's still that really large number of people out there who only have 2 machines. Like that's the thing that I always had to get reminded of when I was doing my scroll console. I was like, oh no, you're not Facebook. You have a web server.
Yeah. My experience is that that's all I've ever done. I know how to do a pre-seed, but I've never got around to implementing that.
Yeah.
So the company I used to work for had maybe done 50 to 100 servers, but probably all of them done off the ISO by hand.
Yeah. They used actually.
Because it's only 5. I always had it, so we just did a minimal install, right? So it's about 5 things you have to say and install.
Put it in the puppet. Yeah.
And there are people who always have to use the alternate CD to install their laptop because they want RAID, LVM, something like that on it too. So it leaks out a bit. outside of just the server
Yeah.
area.
So, to focus back on what you were saying about actual testing of the installer rather than preceding, is anybody aware of anything that framework-wise that will actually...
It was running
Yeah.
at some point, yeah. I
Did
had
an auto test?
I had it running for a while, but maintaining it is a
Yeah, I
massive
took
pain.
over from Karen.
Yeah, it's a pain to maintain.
Yes,
Yeah.
and even with our changes, it was still painful.
Why is it a pain to maintain? Because you have to get new
Every
screenshots.
Because
time-
it didn't have any concept of fuzzy matching. So even if like the slightest thing changed, you would have to regenerate all these many step files. So I ended up making a kind of a meta thing where I really stitched them together based on a description of the various steps that might be included. But even then, it's just maintaining it when anything at all changed in the entire process. It was a massive pain.
And I think it was Lucid. Lucid changed a lot that installer, and we didn't have one single moment of change. There were many times during the cycle they changed. And every time you changed, you'll have to go and reselect your piece of the screen and regen the hash. So it was nice. It was actually nice.
So what it did was it used the APM to basically launch and install, and then it would recognize what was on the frame buffer, and then based on when the right things turned up, it would click on something, type something, and then it would wait for the next thing that it could recognize to turn up, and then it would do something. And then I think in the end it actually recorded it so that you could, if it failed, you had like an MPG or something that you could look at and see the entire process up until it failed, and say, oh right, this is why it failed, because it looked different here or there. But yeah, maintaining it is a pain.
So, sorry, something you mentioned a while ago now was actually using OpenStack boot from ISO
Yeah.
work testing.
So this doesn't exist yet, but ideally what I'd like to be able to do is basically upload an ISO to some kind of cloud thing. It would boot the ISO so that you would see the same stuff as you do when you just booted regularly. And you would be able to connect to it over VNC, so you could remote control it in the same way as, you would wait for something to turn up, click on it, or type something, and so on and so on. And then that would actually completely replicate the...
How much butchering would be involved from that compared to the default experience?
How much what?
Butchering of the actual image.
Well, nothing.
So if we wanted to use this for ARM testing as well, for example,
Right.
if we had an ARM supported cloud.
EQ, I mean.
No, I was thinking actually on ARM hardware itself. So I mean,
I'm not
And then
completely
how
sure
would
what...
you hook it up to VNC?
so how do we go to?
How would you hook the installer up to VNC? It's not virtualized or EQ, I mean.
Well, I have some ideas about that as well, actually. If we wanted to do hardware... Well, shit, something like that.
Well, I mean, some server, ILO systems have, it's not VNC, it's typically some Java shit. But why it's not VNC and why they're developing their own Java VNCs, I have no idea, but it's basically because they're usually retarded. But past that,
True story.
no, I'm not kidding. Like they're wasting a whole bunch of effort. They could just like plop a VNC on their ILO, and things would make so much more sense. Anybody from Dell or HP here?
They're talking about
Jesus
it in
Christ.
an RA something at the moment.
Yeah, it's crap. But the thing is that even with that, like the idea there of, hey, boot this ISO on, because you can, Cobbler or Orchestra kick an ISO onto one of those things without a pre-seed file, and it will quite happily stick its prompting GUI pages to nothing because there's headless, and then if you actually connect through the Java VNC bullshit, you could do those steps in a clunky way.
Right.
Exist. Figuring out how we can convince a vendor to put a real freaking VNC on their ILO system would be fantastic. But
So these ARM servers that we're waiting for are going to have such systems that you can ask.
might have more of a chance of convincing those guys to stick a VNC server on their bootloaders.
But it's way easier for, in this particular case, it's way easier for ARM because the primary way that you interact with it, at least what I've seen so far is over a serial port. And recognizing stuff on a serial port is way easier than recognizing stuff, in anything else. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a regular expression. Bang.
Yeah.
Oh, it prompts me for a password because.
Well, hold on, does that mean that you're expecting the ISO installer on ARM server
No.
to be serial only?
No,
Then
I'm not
how-
expecting an ISO installer for ARM at all because that's not how it works now, is it?
We do have.
Really?
They don't-
Can you get an ARM thing with an ISO with a CD on it?
All of our-
No, it's not a CD image, but
ISO
to
image.
do
It's a USB
DI
image.
install.
Yeah, it's a USB.
Right. So that's not. Then it doesn't run the installer. I mean,
Yeah,
the regular
it does.
installer. It doesn't. It uses OEM install, right?
Yeah.
No, it does for the desktop, but for the server, something they did with this cycle was going to do netboot installs, so therefore it's still using DI.
But we should be testing netboot installs then, preceded, because I think for our server that's going to be the majority of installs.
I think
If you're
at any
going to get
rate.
these densities on ARM that everybody thinks they're going to do, you're not going to be doing that.
I think at any rate.
Well, I know, you're just guessing, yeah.
Yeah. At any rate, whatever we're going to have to do for ARM is going to be different in some way from
Yeah.
what we're used to.
yeah.
So I think until we know what that's.
Well, no, the
that
actual
actually-
is it can't be outscope because at the moment our infrastructure for testing the ISO is totally incompatible with using it for ARM. And
Right.
that's something which is, of course, a big problem. We need to solve that as part of this as well.
Well, the thing is, until we know exactly what that install experience is going to be like, it's kind of hard to start.
Well,
Building.
for starters, we can't. For starters, we can't couple it with KVM. I mean,
No, I know. But I'm just saying, until we know what it's going to be like, I mean, it's kind of hard to start thinking it into the design process of some other testing framework.
Yeah, but I think what David's saying is that we know that it's not going to work with KVM. So we're talking ourselves out of that, so anything that we could even possibly integrate with ARM and put it in the short term. And that's 2 cycles. So I'm assuming KVM is 2 to 4 years away.
I think that's a move. If we have a testing challenge with ARM now, we need to address that. And whether we do that virtually or through using hardware and an appropriate control mechanism, that doesn't matter. It's not going to be the same framework as what we do
No.
for our virtualized asset testing.
Right.
It'll be something different. Okay, so
Is it? Never mind. I was going to make a stupid suggestion.
I want to come back to Soren's point on actually testing the installer, because that is something where we have a gap at the moment, because we don't test the installer, we test pre-seed that simulate the installer.
Let me just say, I think that's really useful. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people are going to be using the pre-seed stuff, so that needs to work really well. So I'm not.
And it also gives
saying
us
to
a really
replace
good
that.
feel as to whether an ISO image is not working
Sure.
or not, is
Sure.
working or not. I guess my concern with what we've talked about so far, with potentially resurrecting the original auto test stuff you did, is the maintenance overhead. So how much effort we're going to have to put into that and how much value are we actually going to get out of it at the end of the day.
Right.
Or is what we already have in place and doing manual in a smaller set of manual installs at key milestone points going to be sufficient to cover our requirement?
So a couple of things. First of all, I don't think I would use the same framework again. I would probably use something that used something like OpenCV to.
Great, because that was the stupid idea that I was gonna
Right,
say. So.
and there's already. I mean, Gustavo wrote some Python thingamajig to use OpenCV to talk to identify stuff on the desktop. I
Yeah.
think, and replacing that with something that can look at a VNC frame buffer shouldn't be all that much work. So that's probably something I would use instead, because
Yeah.
there's much less overhead involved in that.
You can get just pretty much any video stream into OpenCV. It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be too hard.
Right.
And honestly, using that to detect rectangular boxes, probably easier than face recognition. So it could be wrong.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So awesome.
But I mean, yes, there was a lot of overhead, but compared to how long time it actually takes to go through all the various test cases on the ISO tracker, I guess it's probably not that bad. It's just, I mean, I've always hated that as well. So, I mean, I hated this and I hated the other thing, but I think in terms of time,
But
it's
also,
probably
But
about
it
the
also
same.
sounds like there's a challenge in getting I mean, recognizing things is one thing, but they still will change over time. Somebody needs to be able to update what the computer vision system expects.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, is if you write the computer vision system, in theory, you could write it to understand boxes with text.
Right.
And what boxes are and what text is and what basically like a reverse widget mapping. You could write like an inverse of the GTK widgets or whatever.
Right.
And then you could then potentially in script or some sort of metadata describe what you're expecting conceptually rather than having to do screenshot changes. You know, so like if a pixel changes on all of the OK buttons, well then you just change what an OK button looks like.
Right.
But if the OK button moves slightly, well, computer vision isn't looking for the OK button to be here; it's looking for an OK button.
I think it's really all about how much effort has been put into the tools that you use to maintain, you know, these things.
Yeah.
These descriptions of what is supposed to happen, and when something happens, what do you do? Because what I had to work with back then was really quite primitive.
Oh yeah.
Also, don't forget that accessibility frameworks allow the kind of introspection we're talking
Not
about.
for text mode installs, but I know they use that for some testing of stuff on the desktop. What's the project called?
It
I forget.
might be worth thinking about making the text mode installs more accessible. As long, you know,
they're quite accessible.
way implementing a computer vision system against making the text modes install accessible. It's worth thinking about.
They sort of are, because it's the interface, right? That's why how precedes files work. So, but that's not what we're testing. We're trying to test what the user ends up with. It's like saying DevConf has got multiple front ends, but
Yeah.
we want to see what it's actually.
You actually want to test that the help screen is rendered the way you're
Yeah.
expecting the help
Yeah,
screen to be
exactly.
rendered.
Yep. And if someone actually made this, I mean, the desktop team could use it as well.
And that's what I'm thinking.
I had
It's
a-
particular challenge for
Yeah.
desktop at the moment.
Yeah.
I did just a proof of concept thing that would actually boot the desktop ISO, and it would click on install, and I got it to ignore the time, you know, the clock at the top right corner, because that's obviously going to change the next time you boot it. So it only, you know, look for the install button, click on it, and then just type a few things, and it could actually complete the install of that. So it's definitely reusable, you know, across the board. So maybe
It's just developing that into
more
an
people
actual
would help.
framework with inputs that can be.
Yeah.
Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to ask your testers to write OpenCV code.
Right.
Yeah, that's the wrong choice. Please update this.
The thing that Gustavo wrote actually takes, so you store like the bitmap that it's supposed to look for, so a bitmap that represents the button that it's supposed to look for, and then just finds it, you know, within, you know, close to this point on the screen.
Yeah.
And then when it sees it, then it does this and that and whatever.
Yeah.
So it should be reasonably straightforward to maintain it
Oh, yeah.
if the tools are there.
Oh yeah.
So something that will, you know, run it and then show you the current output from this virtual machine, and then you can say, well, this is the part I want you to look for, and when you see it, click on it. It's just a matter of getting the tools there.
No. So,
And,
yeah.
and there's a lot of, I mean, it should be possible to find someone on the desktop team or the QA team, whatever, that's interested in it as well, because there's a lot of,
Oh.
this is not just for server.
No.
Yeah, there's
Just-
Gemma was talking about that at QA
Yeah.
So.
in quite a lot of detail. So I think she's already got something that works apparently, so it might be worth. speaking
Oh,
about
great.
that.
Cool.
I mean, past bitmaps, writing something that I actually just read the Glade files for an application and programmatically understood what it was supposed to be looking for from a CV perspective would
Right.
probably be killer useful to every GTK dev out there. Just saying.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm excited to see what that tool is.
Okay, so there's a question by RFC as well. Possible to improve QA to prevent LTS backported kernel problems on point releases?
So I haven't looked at the bugs, but is that saying the install actually breaks? This is when told to. I don't understand that. Is that maybe something which is added to pre-seed or similar?
Let's bring on.
While we're waiting on that, we need to work item on doing the research into the visualization stuff.
Yeah.
With one word, like EMC server, that would, instead of looking at an X server, we look at the frame buffer. So as soon as you have a kernel running, then you can run this,
Yeah.
run this thing, and then you can VNC into a server that doesn't even run X. You can see the console, and if someone starts X on it, then you see
Why didn't you
X.
write that as a kernel module?
Because I'm not insane.
Ah.
Not
But
that
it-
insane.
So I come into column to write that as a kernel module.
These bugs seem to relate. You don't really see that though.
Oh, yeah.
So are you saying when you're using non-standard boot options, some of the other features in the pre-installer menu?
And this is with backported kernels.
That's something which can't be tested to easily precede trying out different menu options, is it?
Not with precedes, no. Well, no, well,
No, you just can't. Not.
well, not unless, I mean, you go and,
We're trying a different kernel. boot
as a
option.
human, go in and look, I mean, this is what would happen if you clicked on this thing,
Yeah.
but, and then
And that's
replicate
something
that.
which should be solved with OpenCV stuff.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
this is something we don't deal with right now, we could deal. It seems it's an option on the installer. We could check for it. Is this an alternate installer? Like
Yeah,
a-
the DVD installer, yeah.
Does this need to be in the vision stuff, or can it just be via preset?
I think it's some vision stuff, because, I mean, this is saying if you put CD in and press F4, and then select an option, that's something which to me isn't safe to just precede and expect it to be the same page.
Most of the, what's the use case? What are the users going to struggle with? Because this is a slightly more obscure situation. It's not like release day server ISO.
No, but you could again, if you were doing, I mean, you can do different kernel command lines via cobbler when you're booting an ISO.
Yeah, but you're not testing the actual menu there.
I think
Oh,
to
then
address
is
this
the
particular
menu-
problem is, I think that's a matter of adding something to the ISO tracker thing that, you know, when on milestones, this is something we should check.
Check the
I don't
video.
see any useful way to automatically,
We don't test the DVD at all.
No. well, whoever thinks it would be interesting to test the DVD should have this on their checklist.
Yeah.
That's my point. I don't think there's any useful way that we can, you know, generalize this into a problem that can be programmatically checked.
Well, no, it can, using the visual testing rather than precede.
Sure, but you still need to know that, all right, I need to make sure that there is an option to do server install, there's an option to do use the newer kernel install, and there needs to be an option to do server install with the newer kernel, which is what this
so
problem
the
is.
test cases have to be composed.
So, yes, you can check for it when you've told it to specifically look for this
When
thing.
you've added that
But
case,
to-
you don't know to add the case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's
perhaps
what-
there's also a work item in investigation of targets for testing as well. Basically put the CD in and see what options there are, which we're not covering.
Yeah. So that's precisely my point. I mean, this, to solve this, you need to extend,
Well, the options are
add a test case for
there,
this. to
but
the ISO.
will they continue to be there and do they work? Because in that one, there is an option there, but it doesn't work because no one tests it.
So it's really about expanding the test cases we have to cover this area, isn't it?
Some of these test cases you guys are talking about writing up, I've already got written up that I did on ARM. You can just reuse those.
Can you-
Manual test cases at the moment, but most of them should be fairly straightforward to automate.
Which
Can
ones?
you add your URL to document them on this?
They're all, the last, they're in two different blueprints for last cycle.
Yeah, can you add a link to this pad?
Yep.
With where they are.
Which specific test cases were they covering? Toby?
A lot. So, okay, Server row ARM image validation was one blueprint. And so I'll get the other one.
So can you explain how that works, by the way? The ARM testing stuff that you have running?
I did it all manually.
Oh, okay.
Because most of these tests that I went to run, there was no test cases.
Right.
And there wasn't even any documentation on how to install it on some of these cases.
Okay.
So, like doing cluster file systems and stuff like that was interesting.
That's one word for it.
Yeah, I had a cluster file system on essentially a bunch of cell phones. How cool is that? The other one is ARM server image validation. I've got a single wiki on the documentation I wrote.
Yeah, if you can shove that in the pad, that'd be really helpful.
I'm loading up web pages as I go.
I'm just really keen that we ensure that our install testing is kind of the first phase. So we know prior to trying to do anything more complicated that actually what we're using as the first phase of testing is good. Because there's no point running the rest of it if your resulting server image just doesn't even boost.
Right.
Is my take on it, yeah.
Puddings for wussies.
I did write some stuff down. So one thing we did talk about was adding pre-seed installs to the set of daily tests we do. Because although we're doing them from ISO, we're not doing network installs on a daily basis. So we'll add that to the list.
We are actually going to get that as a side effect of the OpenStack testing that we do now, aren't we? Does it need?
Yeah, but I'd rather know it works before we... As I said, it's like this cascade of testing that we need to follow. So if we know Orchestra and pre-seed network install is broken, there's no point in trying to spin up as the test.
Well, yeah,
So
but
if we
that's what I'm
start-
saying. So I was talking about to you yesterday about exit as soon as it breaks. And so we're going to get that as a byproduct of the Orchestra testing, isn't it now? The OpenStack testing
Wait.
we're doing.
It depends on what you want that OpenStack testing to, so if you don't do that in sort of two bits that at least know something about each other, then I think you're gonna get to the point where where breaks that you have in the OpenStack testing are gonna start being ignored by people who have interest in OpenStack, because if you have too many of them, they're just caused by a bad daily ISO.
Yeah.
Then I'm just saying,
Yeah,
like,
but
in
what
theory.
I'm saying is we're looking to test the full stack
Yeah.
with the OpenStack per commit.
Yeah.
So we're going to be testing it before it's even on the ISO, aren't we? You know, so we're already testing it before this test is even going to run. So that's a futile test, isn't it?
This is one of those tests for problems, test velocity.
I mean, if you think it's the right thing, James, then we'll carry on. But I'm not sure I see the benefit to adding that test case.
Hang on, how are you
To
going to
not-
test it before it hits the ISO?
One second. Orchestra has context outside of OpenStack test, is my first take on that. We need to know that we have rock solid network installation system, and that's the one that serves in delivery. And irrespective of any complex testing that may use that,
It doesn't.
we should test that individually, and we should raise public course as automatically as we can at the back of that when it's not working. That then doesn't cloud any of the complex deployment testing stuff we're doing.
One other thing I just thought was, let's say that you introduce a regression into a net install test, and nobody's done any work on OpenStack, no one's done a commit recently, then you're not going to detect that breakage because you're running the test. You see what I mean?
It's not a particularly complicated test.
It's also easier to identify
Right.
where the problem is if you know the project.
One thing I'd like to point out briefly here when you guys are discussing developing some of these test cases and test suites, keep in mind that a lot of systems don't run on KVM. So unless you're specifically testing virtualization, try to make sure your tests will run on any environment. Because right now, most of our tests only do KVM.
Did you arrive late, did you know?
Yeah, I was across the hall in another session.
We did discuss the ARM use case quite in depth, actually.
Of course.
No,
And they also discuss the ARM mono issues over there.
It transcends the ARM. We also
But there's also an x86.
are going to also make the bare metal install on AMD and i386.
I have a spec on that this afternoon, so no more depth.
I think once we got through UDS, we probably just need to wrap up and make sure we understand where the overlaps are and where we've got some reviews. Because there's bound to be some, even if it's just the test case. Okay, I haven't got anything else specifically to cover in this session, so unless anybody else has got anything else they want to raise, we can probably call that right. I can see David already looking at this.
I mean, it's pretty similar to what Carlos was saying there. I mean, I would really like decoupling from KVM. Really, is in the KVM is an option for the tests, but the tests can be run external as part of the.
So you want options on how you execute your tests in terms of whether it's virtualized or not?
Yeah, I think it'd be quite nice, really, because I mean that would unblock totally from doing automated testing for the ARM stuff.
Well, that statement is kind of assuming that as long as it's not KVM, then everything's the same. It's not.
Well, no, what I'm saying is so at the moment, libvirt is the heart of this, yeah, and I'm not sure that, I think there needs to be an abstraction layer above libvirt, actually, for supporting bare metal or virtualization. Do the else really cracks?
I'm just.
You have a reserve session on discussing that because it's come up a few times, isn't it? Where you put bare metal in the stack.
Yeah, we've also had some other thoughts about how to get that driven by Nova. So yeah, we should definitely talk about that, but it might be slightly out of.
I'm wondering. I mean, is it?
Well, yeah.
Do you really think it's necessary to go through? I mean, a lot of the differences between a lot of these different test cases that we have on the ISO tracker, are only software related. I mean, they do not. I mean, there is no difference between doing it. I mean, if you run Apache, I mean, it's going to be the same in KVM or on hardware. If not, then we have another much more serious problem that we would probably, or at least hopefully, have discovered beforehand.
Well, the
So
problem
I don't think necessarily that there's any point in running every single test on both KVM and hardware. So I think we need some way to ensure. I mean, doing a lot of these things in KVM is really simple.
I don't think it's unreasonable, but at least milestones test to be the whole test to be run on bare metal as well. So basically, we do the daily stuff on KVM, but at least milestone stuff we test on bare metal. I mean, it makes sense to test both.
Right. It's just if you would let me finish. So the thing is, I mean, a lot of these things are, makes perfect sense to run in KVM because all the differences between the different tests should show equally well in KVM as anywhere else.
Sure.
So what we need to find out is some way to.
KVM.
Sorry?
Show me the results of running into an ARM system in KVM. What I'm saying is write your test case.
Yeah, but you don't know what I'm saying yet because I haven't gotten to it yet because you guys keep interrupting me. God damn it. Look, a lot of these things are going to be the same on KVM, on hardware, or anywhere else you're going to run it. So that's not the issue. The difference is, I mean, there are definitely some things that are going to be different on hardware and in KVM. And when I say hardware, I mean it's probably going to be different on x86 and ARM as well. So what we need really is some way to verify that those differences are covered. So we need to make sure that. I don't think we need to test every single little thing in every single environment necessarily. As long as we have confidence that where differences matter, we test things, and where they don't, we can, with reasonable confidence, get by with just testing it in one of the environments.
What process do you want to follow to make the decision about whether a test should run in one environment or all environments? The trouble is, I think
careful
you need-
consideration.
Yeah, the trouble is you need that process, whereas if you
Well, sure.
if we can have a framework that allows us to test it across everything,
Then I think you will
don't
not be
need that
able to run all your tests within any reasonable time frame.
Sure you will.
Yeah, because ARM's an independent metal thing that's running, so it doesn't, it's not taking away from the KVM resource.
I know.
I assume.
I know. It's just, I mean, as this develops, I mean, the matrix just grows and it's like incredibly many dimensional. So if you insist on running every single test in every single environment, I mean,
That doesn't
We're not saying you
doesn't
need
add gain.
We're not saying you have to run it in every single environment, we're just saying you need to make sure you can run it in every
Yeah,
single
no,
environment.
I'm with Sorry on that. We don't need to run it all. It doesn't make sense.
If you write all your tests, just because you want to be able to do some quick testing on Apache, but you're only going to run it in KVM, you've completely hosed the ARM environment. We cannot run it, period. There may be a breakage in the ARM code or in the Apache code that only manifests on ARM hardware. I can't test it because your test suite doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I think the two things are actually reasonably orthogonal. There's one, the development of the framework that allows you to run tests on bare metal or virtualization or whatever it is we're going to do there, and then which tests you run where and when is it's a different axis.
So something we can do, but it digs us deeper, is we can use virtualized ARM. Yeah, because we can run all these tests in virtualized ARM. I mean, as it is, we don't have ARM servers anyway, so, you know, what's the difference between a Panda board and a QEMU virtual machine? But the thing is, then we're sort of entrenching ourselves further into coupling into this method.
so I think a lot of this could really be solved by if we, I mean, this is focusing on the install process, but there's a lot of stuff that, well, it's not, is it? Because there's Apache test, there's SSH test and whatever.
But I don't think that's the key focus for this testing. I think it is about installing a server and having something you can SSH to by the end of the day.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that they're almost legacy. I mean, if we implemented the plans we had last time, we wouldn't have TouchSal at the end of the install. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that was the way we agreed that was something that we would attempt to drop. So they're there because that's what was in the test cases from 3 releases ago, not because I think they add any huge amount of value. They do test the stuff in stores and the processes run at the end of the day.
Right.
And that does add something. But
That's not, so there's really a distinction between the options picked in the installer. So we're saying we want an Apache server in the installer, and does that function, and does the installer manage to install Apache? But the functionality test of Apache at the end of it overlaps with the user space testing. That's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
I don't even think you have to test that the installer. I think if you test that the installer installs Apache when it says that it installs Apache,
Yeah,
then you can test whether installing Apache works outside of the context. I don't think that you need to make sure the ISO tester also tests that Apache works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It just needs to test that it'll freaking install it when you select web server.
Right.
You know, that's where that thing. And then the other stuff we can, if we and I'm hand waving, but if we for the things that aren't the installer bits, if we focus on and I'm going to say OpenStack because that's what I'm working on, but if we focus on a thing that knows how to test things in machine resources that you can ask something for, then we've got at least 3 or 4 other conversations going on about how we can get ARM machines and bare metal machines and other things spun up as part of that same process. So if we start with the interface of our testing thing wants to ask things for resources on which to run things that aren't this is never going to work that way. This is computer vision and different things. But I think we can attack that other one from many different angles at the same time and get to somewhere useful, so that we can run the tests you want to run, and then we can also have arguments about not running those tests.
Right.
You know, so that physically we can have that conversation.
I mean, if you're doing like code path testing, yeah, you do that on KVM all you want.
Right.
But say you want to do performance analysis testing.
Sure.
Try running performance analysis testing in an unknown load state on KVM.
Yeah, I
server.
know.
Yeah.
So there, it makes more sense to have
Right.
bare metal.
So I think
So
as long as
we need
can
to
run-
check the different
Yeah.
things when we have any reason to believe there might be a difference. really. I mean, because otherwise, I mean, it will be like a 60-dimensional matrix of stuff we want to test, and as soon as you add just one little extra variable to it, I mean, things just explode.
And once I keep coming back to this, we have to have this layered approach to testing.
Right.
So install first,
Yeah.
then we need a good test suite that exercises the core applications we have for Ubuntu on ARM, x86 hardware, virtual, whatever it might be, on OpenStack.
Yeah.
It should be the same test everywhere.
Yeah.
And we
It's
don't
just
have that
it's
dimension.
different.
It's just how that infrastructure is provisioned to then deliver that test is the differentiator between those platforms. We don't have that at the moment. But hopefully we might have plans on that by the end of this week. So. Okay, so we're clear what ISO testing is now. Yeah, good. Right. Anything else anybody wants to raise? Dare I ask?
So,
No, it's Dave's gone now, so we'll
a
probably
general question. But so when you put the ISOs for testing, you like remaster them? Is that right?
Yeah, basically.
So we really should get into the installer some way that it would look for a pre-seed on an attached disk or something.
Rather than remastering.
Then you don't have to do that 700 megabytes of I/O. All it does
Then you
is-
have a different set of problems, because if you just boot the ISO, it's just going to show you the login, I mean the choose your language thing, and it's not going to get anywhere,
Why?
because that's what it does.
I don't understand.
If you boot the ISO, what happens?
Sure, it asks you the language thing.
Right,
Yeah.
I haven't done it in a very long time, so I don't really know.
okay, so just making sure that when it actually gets going, when the installer actually gets going, it will log on and attach block device for a pre-seed file. It's not going to cut it, because you still need to make some changes to the ISO to make sure that it actually gets around to running the Debian installer, i.e. chooses a language and chooses install Ubuntu.
Whatever.
Which, admittedly, is reasonably simple. It's just a matter of sending 2 key presses to it. But you need to do something.
You're talking about Grub.
No, it doesn't use grub. It uses ISO Linux.
Oh, yeah, sorry. But yeah, so the bootloader.
Yeah. But it's my point is that if you're
So
if
you're
this is an
remastering
effort
those two
to
things.
avoid remastering the ISO, then I mean it's more complicated than it just sounds on the surface, because it's not just a matter of teaching the installer to look on an external block device for a preseed file, because if you don't remaster the ISO and you just boot it, it's just going to sit there waiting for you to choose your language.
Because when he remasters the ISO now, he also changes ISO Linux.
Yeah, but basically go completely work around ISO Linux.
Right. You pass it, right, you add the command line that says there's a C.
No, that's not how the framework works. We don't do that. We work around that by actually net booting the instance, but then that drops it back down onto the CD. So we actually work around ever having to go through ISO Linux.
Yeah, so you work around it.
We just work around it. So it PXE boots and then just straight installs off the
Oh, is that how it works now?
Yeah.
Pixie boots.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well,
So then, in that case, if the installer did look for that,
well, if it Pixie boots, why do you remaster it?
Because,
Yeah.
look, I haven't touched this in 6 months, so I'm struggling to remember exactly why we do that. But let me just have a quick look.
So in theory, there was a reason when you did it originally.
There was a reason why we did it.
That's all I need from James.
Just can't remember why.
It's probably just to make Soren angry.
It's working.
Yeah? Yeah, I can see his rage. Yeah.
I think we're on camera.
Yeah. Camera. Oh,
Hi, Mom.
God.
Send more money.
I shouldn't have been looking at nearly as much porn as I've been looking at.
A little bit is okay on camera, but,
Yeah, but
yeah,
like,
you were
I
doing
mean,
like the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, like, you gotta, sometimes you gotta...
I stand correct, we don't remaster the ISO.
You don't? Okay.
What we do is we extract the
Kernel and
the
stuff.
init ID and the kernel from the ISO. We then inject a new pre-seed into the init ID,
Right.
and then we network boot that, but it then still installs off the
Oh, you
ISO.
still network boot, still?
Yeah, and it puts that into the PXE configuration.
Oh, is that, we'll have up here?
Yeah, so
Can you go on?
God, that's really small.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
you-
So Yeah, we.
Seems a bit of a
Receive
long
MAC
function.
address test.
It's not a function, it's a script. This was one big hack when we wrote it.
Go
Yeah,
on.
it pulls the kernel and the init RD out.
Yeah.
And then it
Generate preset.
generates a pre-seed, because it uses templating
Sure.
mechanism, generate pre-seed. Then it unpacks the init ID.
Yeah.
And does some stuff. It injects a couple of things into
Uh-huh.
the init ID from memory.
Yep.
Then it sticks that on the TFTP route.
Yep.
Let me see. Let's ignore this thing.
Compressing it. Attaching.
Yes, it sticks everything in couch, so it's successful. We were using GPXE originally, and booting straight off the couch DB instance. But that wasn't packaged, so we actually took that out. Yeah, we set
So
up.
I'm kind of curious why you're using Pixie. I mean, what does that add compared to just passing the kernel and init directly to KVM?
It's a good point. Because there's actually some opportunities.
Well, I would argue that Pixie is a way that people are likely to install things, whereas passing a
Yeah.
kernel directly to KVM is less. So
This is.
Well, it's the same thing really, except that you're using. I mean, it's the same thing that happens.
Yeah.
Only you're testing that Pixie booting in KVM works.
yeah, that's true.
Because as soon as the GPXE ROM from KVM lets go of things, it's
Yeah.
exactly the same thing. Because what it does is it just puts stuff into the right memory locations and hits play, and then, which is what KVM would do on its own.
You still
But I mean,
still
it's
like
useful to know
that.
that Pixie booting works in KVM. I mean,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I was just
That's not the
This
intent
doesn't-
here isn't to test Pixie boot.
That's what I
was
thought.
just the workaround
Yeah.
to make it do stuff.
As a side effect, this test doesn't depend on the KVM.
This test does.
Mm.
Yeah,
It does not.
it does.
It does?
Well,
Why?
it does because that's what it uses, but you would reasonably easily be able to use not KVM because you have like the Pixie artifacts.
You could also do Pixie booting from
Giving-
Zen or Pixie booting from QEMU.
I was thinking more hardware.
I'm kidding.
Ah,
Sorry, I have a weird sense of humor.
So at the moment, this stuff is tied
Okay.
into KVM, but you could refactor it to. And when we originally wrote this, it was like, okay, we need to get something running,
sure.
and we could refactor it into a more generic, reusable set of components that allow you to do stuff on hardware or virtual.
Right.
But that's just never happened. So.
But given the way it works, that should be pretty simple. I mean, just don't start KVM instead.
Yeah,
You know,
just
somehow
boot,
trigger an
turn
event
on
that-
some bit of hardware that.
turn on a bit of hardware that has wig on that or whatever.
Yeah, that's kind of how we saw it.
Yeah.
So.
That makes sense.
Right, marvelous. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Can we go eat food now?
Yeah.
I'm excited about that.
Well, eating food is lovely, life-preserving, you know.
The other thing about this is I actually package it and stick it in a PPA. So if you want to install the scripts and all the right dependencies and have it configured, it's actually relatively easy.
Nice.
So at the moment we're bundling all the actual tests that run in that package. So if you update the test, you have to update the package. Pain in the ass. I'm definitely going to change that. But that goes back to Tony's point about having generic tests. It
When
doesn't
somebody
matter
was-
what framework you're running to provision your infrastructure.
Yeah.
You can pull the test case and run it
Yeah.
from somewhere else.